And that's at 6? So it's all this, yeah. And Twisted Pine is on Walnut, isn't it? 30th and Walnut. Is the Best Buy gone? Wow. Oh. And the Best Buy near there. So it's a cool spot. It's kind of like off the beaten path. So it's sweet. And then you can go to Torchy's afterwards. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I think if we're going, the only thing that can hear Zoom is this mic, right? So if anybody, I'll just hold it and run around if anybody has any questions. Yeah, I'm gonna escape and stop sharing. There you go. Okay. Oh no, it stopped. Okay. So Andrew, can you hear us and unmute?
Yes, I can hear you, and I can unmute. Am I coming through okay?
Hear you.
Okay, cool. All right. Happy, what is today, Wednesday? Happy Wednesday, everybody. I'm glad to be there with you all the way from Lincoln, Nebraska. I'm going to talk to you today about checklist-driven development. You should be able to see a sweet bison on the screen right now. Is that accurate? Yes, maybe, no?
Yes, we.
Okay, cool. I know that Boulder has a certain affinity for bison, so I wanted to reflect that. This bison happens to be in Nebraska, but that's okay. So we're talking about checklist-driven development. Oops. Which is a thing, and we're going to talk about it pretty briefly. First, a little bit about myself. My name is Andrew Eck. I'm the Director of Development Director, something like that, for a consultancy called Unabridged Software, which is based here in Lincoln, Nebraska and Omaha, Nebraska. We build software mostly with Ruby on Rails. I also do a fair amount of Elixir. And I work with organizations on improving processes and making themselves and their people more able to respond to change. So not just like agile software development, but what happens if a cool opportunity comes along, but nobody has the technical chops to take it? Or how do we plan to be able to make big, bold choices in the coming years? Those are the types of things that I get to work on. It's pretty fun. So the question that I'm going to pose, this is going to be a rhetorical question, as this is a fairly short talk, is how often do complex operations, such as deployments, fail because somebody forgot a step? My guess is that almost everyone in here has the experience of breaking production. If you haven't, I would argue that it's a thrilling experience that's maybe not to be repeated too many times, but certainly thrilling. And then the corollary to that is, what is the cost of failures like this? And this can be the opportunity cost, the material cost, the time cost, lost customers, et cetera, from things like production outages. Think about, for example, the US East S3 outage that happened, what was that, 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago? Where Amazon S3 went down for US East and the entire internet basically broke for 6 hours. That's a real cost. Like, that's a multi-million-dollar mistake. None of mine have been that big yet, but hopefully someday. So let's do a brief case study. A few years ago, I was working with a payment gateway, so think a competitor to Stripe or Square or something like that. And we had a series of Rails microservices that were actually a big old monolith, in that if we wanted to deploy a feature, we often had to make 5 or 7 unique deploys very quickly and orchestrated properly, otherwise everything would break. This happened a couple of times. And in, like a line of business application that only internal companies use, your application goes down, maybe that's an opportunity for everyone to take a long lunch. With payment software, if your application goes down, somebody is not getting their money and they're going to be pretty ticked about it. So we, after the 4th or 5th time that we broke production, we said to ourselves, man, this really sucks. How can we keep this from happening in the future? And the initial response, because we are all, like people with a strong internal locus of control, the initial answer was, well, we just need to be better, which is not a real answer. I'm going to give you that spoiler right now. It's not a real answer. But the initial thought is we need like better individual action to combat this process problem. But a thing that we were finding was that if you, for example, leave a pull request open for several months, and that pull request happens to have an embedded rake task or happens to have notes about the order that you need to deploy things, then when that gets merged, it is very likely that you've lost a lot of the mental context, especially if you didn't leave really impeccable notes. And even if you did, it's possible those notes won't be read, which meant we broke stuff. So the analogy that I'm going to bring in is to medicine. All right, so this is from the Checklist, which is an essay by Atul Gawande. He was in Bill Clinton's cabinet as like an undersecretary of something or other. He's a surgeon, teaches at Harvard. He says, expertise is the mantra of modern medicine, but what do you do when expertise is not enough? And this is a really great essay, by the way. And what Atul Gawande ended up doing, or rather, what the folks he profiled, in this case, a surgeon named Peter Pronovost at Johns Hopkins, who noticed that there is a significant number of line of infections when central lines were run. I'm not a medical professional, but I understand a central line is when you have like a fluid of some sort being delivered straight into somebody's thorax. They had an 11% infection rate, which I'm not sure how to quantify. I'm not sure how to contextualize that, but it means that just over 1 in 10 people who were there for treatment got some sort of infection right in their squishy bits, and then had to receive further care because of a problem with placing the central line. So he created a checklist of the 6 steps that you need to follow in order to prepare for a central line, and then empowered the nurses to interrupt doctors at any time if the nurses felt like the doctors weren't following the checklist correctly. Over the course of a couple of months, the line infection rate went from 11% to 0%, which in this case, for Johns Hopkins, saved about $2 million in medical expenses, prevented 43 infections, and prevented 8 deaths. And the thing that made this happen was a checklist. A similar checklist was imported into one of the hospitals in Detroit, Michigan, which at the time is one of the poorest performing ICUs in terms of like post-surgical complications. They went from being one of the worst to in the 90th percentile as far as being very good, and ended up saving themselves about $175 million. Similarly, you take your car in to the auto mechanic, and they will often in auto mechanic shops, or if you're buying like a certified pre-owned car, they will say things like a 100-point inspection, where the number of points like goes up as a point of contention. That's a checklist. So the question becomes here, what can we do? The answer is not like everybody needs to be better. The answer is we need to have a codified set of processes, a process that everybody agrees on and that we can follow. In the case of Payment Spring, where I was, we ended up creating a queue of deploys that needed to happen. such that the latest master branch was always deployable, and such that we had basically an index card that listed every single thing that needed to happen for that deploy to go out. Gem updates, migrations, rake tasks, whatever it might be, AWS configuration changes even. So everything that needed to happen for that to go out. And then the idea was that one of the senior developers would then sit with our single DevOps person and go through those one by one and make sure that everything could happen. And what ended up happening was we broke production quite a bit less. I want to say that by the time I left, it had been 7 or 8 months since we broke production for more than about a second while a database migration ran. And even then, I think we got that taken away by improving our database migration patterns. So what it came to was group identification of a problem, discussion of how we might resolve that problem, and then creation of a codified and written down process, a checklist that we could at any time print out and go through, and where there was institutional support behind it, such that if you didn't follow the process, probably you're going to get a finger shaken at you, or strong words uttered in your direction or something like that. We were a pretty genial group, so I'm disappointed that you didn't follow the process that we agreed on. That's about as strong as our words got, but that carries weight. So some takeaways. Thing one is, as you're looking at your work, and in particular, any processes that you have that are error prone or that require a great deal of institutional knowledge and human decision-making, it may be worth thinking about ways that you can codify those. Not everything can be automated. You can automate a lot. You can't quite automate everything yet, and probably will not be able to until we all upload ourselves into the mainframe. In the meantime, time that you spend automating might be better spent writing down on a sheet of printable paper a process that everyone can follow, a flowchart, whatever the thing may be. Thing two, it's really easy, and you see this, I feel like I see this in particular with new leadership that comes in and wants to make a mark, where all of a sudden it is, let's create processes for everything. And I feel like that's a mistake. I feel like that leads to creating processes that don't actually address the problems that exist or meet the needs of the business. So it feels worth it to me to start with things that are particularly error prone or particularly costly, or that feel like, man, we shouldn't have to deal with this thing. We're all, as software developers, we deal with a great amount of information. We take in a lot of information. And after a period of time, you get a sense for problems that you shouldn't have to deal with versus problems that occur every once in a while and that you will have to deal with. Take a look at the ones that you know in your heart of hearts that you shouldn't have to deal with. And then finally, and this is maybe the big thing, along with that institutional buy-in, empowering anyone on your team to interrupt. That was the thing that really made the difference. And in the checklist article that Atul Gawande writes, and in his corresponding book, he does case study after case study after case study of the importance of letting anybody interrupt a process if they feel like it's going incorrectly. And we see this all the time, right? Enron, for example, would not have happened if the people who were like down below had had a chance to speak up and perhaps alert, the relevant feds. There's so many cases of like individual failures that could have been prevented or at least mitigated by process, and in particular by a process that lets people interrupt when they know something is wrong. So this, and not to place like that much moral weight on things like code review, right? You can create a code review checklist. In order for pull requests to be code reviewed, we need screenshots of UI changes. We need test coverage of the new feature. We need a written user story or a written description of the change and why it needs to happen. And then we need, evidence that you've gone through your linter, right? That can be your checklist. It doesn't have to be like on the same scale as like inserting a central line or migrating millions of credit card numbers from one database to another database. It doesn't have to be on that scale. It can be a little thing too. So with this Bison, I guess I'm going to, at this point, wrap in the interest of being respectful of time and things like that. I'll put my contact information up. Also, Dan and Dan and Joel have my contact information as well, so you're welcome to get in touch with me through them or via social media or email, or I don't know, if you find yourself in Lincoln, Nebraska and you happen to be handy with a phone book, any of those can work. But I would love at this time to hear questions, thoughts, comments, impromptu freestyling, whatever you might have.
Hands raised. Anybody?
Yes.
It was thorough. I really liked the interrupt part, especially. I thought that was a really cool piece of you should be able to say, hey, wait, I don't think we're doing. That could even be if someone doesn't understand, right? Like, hey, wait, why are we doing this?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Process doesn't work if people don't understand it. If people don't understand why steps exist or what the steps are supposed to achieve, those steps get skipped. So yeah, and I think that piece has to be there. It's not life or death for us in most cases, unless you're writing medical software. But I do think that step has to be there. So yeah, but that's a good point about not understanding. Or interrupting in the event of not understanding, I should say.
So the title of this talk was Checklist Development.
Mm-hmm.
How did checklist development?
What was that? Could you repeat that?
How did the checklist really drive your development? Do you make the checklist first, or is it?
It is. The checklist drives the development primarily in that the checklist is a codification of process. So for example, if I know that the expectation on pull request is that I write tests and can demonstrate test coverage, then that is going to drive decisions that I make. And this was the case when I worked with payment information, one of the pieces of our checklist in getting code ready to be reviewed was, are you making any, was to document any configuration changes that you make to the application and or any changes to anything that deals with how information is encrypted or decrypted. And as part of the checklist was, if you're making those changes, those have to get signed off on by the relevant security auditors and things like that. And so does that affect how I write individual pieces of code? Yeah, maybe. Does it affect the way that I talk about my code? And does it affect the way that I present things and the way that I share that information with my team? Absolutely. But it wouldn't be the same as test-driven development, for example, where you have your red-green refactor cycle. Even though the name is similar, I don't think that it's probably me being clever rather than something that's perfectly analogous to any of the other blank-driven development processes that exist.
Thank you.
Does that address your question?
Yeah, it does.
Cool.
I think it's sort of just the idea, right, of these are the things I have to do, and can help even, red, green refactor, or just when I do something, if you can break it down in any sort of small part, and that could be on a check or, whatever it wants to be. I mean, I make check time for stories I work on, so
yeah,
it helps a ton just to be the steps that I need,
so
that I can be this is step one, instead of being this is one whole big feature.
Right.
So, the way I break those down.
And having that checklist as a way to share expectations and to have those written down, I think is useful. I write checklists for my own features. Most of those checklists are things that it's just I need to make sure that I handle these concerns, but by the time anyone else on my team sees it, those concerns will have been handled. So it's more about my personal process rather than a team process. But when we do team checklists, we do have on every team that I work on, a list of requirements that have to be met before code can be reviewed formally. Informal code review, of course, can happen at any time for any reason, but before pull requests can be merged, it must meet these requirements without exception. It's a little bit less dogmatic than that, but it's pretty close to that.
Yeah. Always a line to walk there of too much versus not. If you have any of those, just to like share afterwards.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I can. So I guess I've been in communication most with Dan and Joel. So what if I send those along, and then you guys can share them in your appropriate channels?
Yeah, just drop them an email. Nothing that's proprietary.
Yeah, no, none of the stuff that I'm talking about here is proprietary. I don't think any of this will be, if anything, if I can tell my bosses about this, they're going to say, cool, you should write a blog post, rather than, no, don't share it.
That's good. Any more questions? Yep, go on.
Is there an ideal amount of people working on a checklist to ensure accuracy?
Maybe. I guess in thinking about it, I've had the most success working in groups of 2 or 3. At least for like creating something to present and then running it by like the larger group at large. Just in thinking, I was a high school teacher for several years before becoming a software developer, and in thinking about group projects, if you have a group of 6, you've got 2 or 3 people who are doing all the work, and then everyone else is just kind of hanging out and waiting. And that's not, I think that's like a normal consequence of having groups of that size. Yeah, I guess if I had to guess, I would say 2 or 3 people is probably a good number to start, and then like present for feedback and revision to the group at large. But it really depends on your team dynamic too. You may have more or less like weird parochial power dynamics, or provincial power dynamics. Parochial is not the right word. They're provincial, like provincialist power dynamics. I've been pretty lucky to mostly work on small teams with people who are pretty interested in doing good work and not super interested in like establishing their fiefdoms. And actually, Atul Gawande talks about this in his article, how so Peter Prenavost, who developed this thing that, saved millions of dollars, commented on if there were like a single drug or medical device or something like that that had the same efficacy rates, every hospital in the country would have adopted it. And there'd be sales reps all over the place. And in his case, it is a printed checklist that, literally anybody could run off. And he estimated that it would cost $2 or $3 million to implement it in every single emergency room and intensive care unit in the country, which $2 or $3 million compared to like Michigan saved $175 million over like a year and a half. Detroit, Michigan, this hospital that did it. That's a very small amount of money, relatively speaking. But it's a checklist, and doctors have egos. Just like software developers have egos in some cases. So it's not. So it hasn't seen the same spread. Whereas, at least at the time of writing, Spain was preparing like a nationwide project to implement this all over the place, not because Spain is better or worse than the United States, but because there's just like a different culture, at least with regard to doctors and the way that decisions are made. And also a smaller country, which maybe helps. So yeah, I guess, so in thinking about like the number of people, you do have to have institutional buy-in. I think you can be strategic as far as how you create these things, in the same way that you have to be strategic anytime you're making a process change. There have to be opportunities for buy-in. There have to be opportunities for feedback, but also getting everybody in a room together and bashing it out sometimes just means you end up bike shedding, which you might anyways, but at least then you can spread your bike sheds out.
Great. We super appreciate your time. No one else else have any questions? Good. Everyone can clap. Here, everyone's. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. I will send those checklists along. I will also send along like the relevant links in case folks are interested. Yeah, thank you so much for letting me crash your space.
Yeah, for sure. You're welcome to stay on if you want to check out the next talk. I'm not sure how that will work, but
let's find out.
yeah, Mike, you have to hold the microphone. But Adam's on too, so that'd be great. Thanks again, Andrew.
Thank
Okay,
you so
so
much.
we'll just do a quick 5-minute break if you want to refuel. And bathroom is very hard to get to, but available.